On our broadcast tonight, this is a big time at the Justice Department, where this was the Attorney General's first anniversary on the job. And he got tweeted at by the president a day after saying the president's tweets made it impossible for him to do his job. And Barr is still making news, ordering a fresh and unusual outside investigation into the case of Michael Flynn. And we learned today the Justice Department has dropped its case against Andrew McCabe. And the first ballots in the first Western presidential contest get filled out just hours from now, but fair warning, Nevada may be way more like Iowa than a lot of Democrats care to admit. All of it as this Valentine's night edition of the 11th Hour gets underway. Well, good evening once again from our NBC News headquarters here in New York. Day 1121 of the Trump administration. That leaves 263 days to go until the 2020 election. Two other quick numbers here tonight. The president is at Mar-a-Lago for the 29th time as president, his 175th day there as president. Back home in Washington, another fairly explosive day at the usually quiet Justice Department, and a second straight day of completely mixed signals, including what appears to be a slow-rolling campaign to seize increasing amounts of control over politically charged cases, and they are numerous. The New York Times was the first to report that Trump's AG Bill Barr has tapped an outside prosecutor to, quote, scrutinize the criminal case against President Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. Barr has also installed a handful of outside prosecutors broadly reviewing the handling of other politically sensitive national security cases. They go on to say over the past 2 weeks, the outside prosecutors have begun grilling line prosecutors in the D.C. office about various cases. Well, you may recall that Flynn has pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI during special counsel Mueller's investigation of ties between the Trump campaign and Russia and all those contacts. Earlier tonight, our senior Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, explained to the audience why a review of this case is raising concerns.
This sets off all sorts of political alarms. First, former FBI officials say if there are concerns, they should call in the inspector general, not a prosecutor. Second, Flynn now wants to withdraw his guilty plea, saying the FBI surprised him. But former prosecutors say being surprised is no excuse for lying to the FBI. That's a crime. Third, as with Roger Stone, the Justice Department overruled the prosecutors last month, reducing Flynn's proposed sentence from 6 months to probation, no jail time. This raises suspicions that even though the president has sole authority over pardons, he may be trying to make a case for a pardon for Flynn.
As that unfolds, the Washington Post is reporting the feds in New York, the office we call the Southern District of New York, has taken new steps into the investigation of the man who once ran the Southern District of New York, Rudy Giuliani. Those new steps include apparently evidence and witnesses potentially against Rudy, even as the main Justice Department in Washington reported days ago with a straight face they've set up a mechanism to receive private citizen Giuliani's information that he has gathered in Ukraine. Also tonight, the Justice Department has now dropped its case against former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, who was accused of lying to investigators about a leak to the media. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington informed McCabe's attorneys, quote, the government has decided not to pursue criminal charges. We consider the matter closed. McCabe opened a counterintelligence investigation into Trump in 2017 after the president fired Comey. That launched the Russia inquiry. That also put McCabe and the FBI in the president's crosshairs, and McCabe has been trolled, threatened, and attacked ever since.
They should be looking at all these FBI guys who got fired and demoted. I think he's a sick guy, personally. Andrew McCabe, he's a bad guy.
Andrew McCabe has made a fool out of himself. I think he's a disaster. And what he was trying to do was terrible, and he was caught.
All of this is taking place while the president appears to be asserting his growing control over federal law enforcement. And as Attorney General Barr is speaking out about Trump's habit of weighing in on all things Justice Department. Yesterday, Barr told ABC News the president's Twitter habit was making it, quote, impossible for him to do his job, and he suggested the president stop it. Hours later, of course, the president tweeted about Barr, quote, the president has never asked me to do anything in a criminal case, AG Barr. This doesn't mean that I do not have, as president, the legal right to do so. I do, but have so far chosen not to. Barr, who today marks 1 year on the job, is under fire for his decision to reverse a sentencing recommendation for convicted Trump ally Roger Stone. The decision was announced shortly after the president criticized the recommended federal sentence of 7 to 9 years. Tonight, the Washington Post reports Roger Stone has requested a new trial a day after Trump accused the jury forewoman of bias. Interestingly, Barr tells ABC News he was all for Stone's prosecution.
I supported it. I think it was established he was convicted of obstructing Congress and witness tampering, and I thought that was a righteous prosecution. And I was happy that he was convicted.
Nonetheless, there are now at least 9 Senate Democrats calling on Barr to resign. They're accusing him of lying to Congress when, during his confirmation hearing, he pledged to keep the law enforcement process free from political influence. One former federal prosecutor and U.S. attorney who we have come to know says, based on the past 24 hours, it is time for the AG to step down from office.
If you're Bill Barr, and if you've gone on record telling the president to stop tweeting, and if you really believe in the independence of the Justice Department, which Barr has at least gone on record as saying he believes in, then when the president's response is to tweet and say he'll meddle in criminal cases whenever he damn well pleases, your only move is to resign.
Here for our leadoff discussion on this busy Friday night, Susan Page, Washington bureau chief for USA Today, best-selling author who's now at work on a biography of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Traveling with the president in the great state of Florida, Philip Rucker, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House bureau chief for the Washington Post, co-author along with his Post colleague Carol Leonnig of the New York Times best-selling book, A Very Stable Genius. And Josh Gerstein, senior legal affairs contributor for Politico. Good evening and welcome to you all. Susan, what do you think the Attorney General is up to? And do you remember a time, though we were too young when the president appointed his own brother, who had never tried a case in court, when the assumption about DOJ was they were going to straight up endeavor to do the right thing in all cases?
Yeah. I mean, there have been times in the past during the Nixon administration, as you say, and the Kennedy administrations, but not in my time in Washington have we seen a situation like this where the president is asserting his right to meddle in any criminal cases that he wishes to do so, and that we have an attorney general that seems to be publicly, if you take him at his word, publicly pleading with the president to stop weighing in on Twitter on the Justice Department issues. There are all these mixed messages coming out of the Justice Department these days. And I guess it depends on whether you think Bill Barr is sincere when he says he's trying to keep things from being too politicized, or if you take a more cynical view that he's just trying to calm a storm that he has in his own building there with career prosecutors.
Well, Josh, that brings us to your beat. It was just Tuesday. The 4 feds walked off the case, choosing to walk off the case because, again, they can't put out statements and call press conferences. This is their form of protest and warning. Then yesterday, the interview that Susan was referencing, people wanting to take an attorney general at his word, becoming the first sitting cabinet member to criticize the boss. What is going on inside the Department of Justice based on your reporting?
Well, Brian, the atmosphere and the uproar is something that I've really only seen on a couple prior occasions during President Trump's term in office. One would be the atmosphere, the feelings surrounding the firing of FBI Director James Comey, and the other would be on a couple days when it looked like Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, who appointed Special Counsel Robert Mueller, was about to be fired by the president. In fact, one day when he was in a car and we were told he was expecting to be asked for his resignation when he arrived at the White House. But I think this is even more severe, more pervasive, and a bigger problem because it really has infected the line prosecutors, the frontline people, the investigators who do the day-to-day work of the Justice Department. As disturbing as some of those other events were, you were really talking about reshuffling the leadership of the Justice Department. And here, after you had those 4 prosecutors withdraw from the Roger Stone case, and one of them quit the government altogether, it became clear that this has infected things all the way down to the ground level, to the nitty-gritty place where the rubber meets the road. And I think that's why you saw the Attorney General come out yesterday and make the statements that he did, because it became a crisis of confidence in him and the department as a whole.
Phil Rucker's no dummy. We note that traveling with the president means in this case you at least get a weekend in Florida. So, Phil, what's the viewpoint of those around this president traveling with the president just like yourself?
Well, Brian, there is so much swirling over the last few days involving the president and the Department of Justice. But one thing that is sure to get the president's attention and perhaps stoke his wrath is the ending, essentially, of this investigation for Andy McCabe. The decision by the Justice Department announced today not to file any charges for the former deputy FBI director. McCabe has been enemy number 1 or 2 for Trump now for more than a year. The president has firmly believed and has said so publicly that he thinks McCabe should have been charged. He surely is not pleased with this decision. My colleagues at the Washington Post reported that earlier today, when that news was announced, the White House did not have a heads up, and that there was an effort underway inside the Oval Office at the White House to calm the president, to control him, to urge him not to speak out about McCabe. Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, rushed in to try to talk to the president right away about this McCabe decision. We'll see what the morning brings in terms of tweets from the president, but I am sure he is none too pleased with the outcome here.
Hey, Josh, for the charges the feds nicked Roger Stone on, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the max is like 20 years if they wanted to throw the book at him. In this case, they did what they always do. They looked at federal sentencing guidelines. They came back with an answer of a recommended sentence 7 to 9 years. President tweets, calls it a miscarriage of justice. Bill Barr, again, with a straight face, says, yeah, I got involved. I took a look at it. Here is Andrew Weissman on how rare it would be for a sitting attorney general to do just what he did.
The Attorney General does not review sentencing submissions. That never happens. Everybody in the department knows that. To make it sound like he did, which is this is kind of a normal thing that I review them. No, he reviewed them in connection with 2 rich white men who are connected to the president. If that is the only 2, I would love to hear from the Attorney General. Who else has he done this for?
So, Josh, first of all, that's saying a lot. Second, this cabinet agency you cover is easily the most process-driven and ideally the most rigor-driven branch of the government.
Right, Brian. And I think it could be up to 50 years that Roger Stone, in theory, could be sentenced to. But the thing that's really troubling and what I would pick up from what Andy Weissman said is when he talked about rich white males, you have a Justice Department who, under this Attorney General, Bill Barr, and the previous one, Jeff Sessions, has gone out of its way to say they thought that the prior administration, the Obama administration, had been too lenient with criminals, particularly folks involved with drugs, and that folks should have been receiving guideline sentences, meaning whatever the sentencing guidelines require. You shouldn't deviate. You shouldn't depart downward because they had a difficult upbringing. You should insist on those in almost every case. And so to come in a case involving, the president's longtime confidant and say, well, in this case, we think maybe the sentencing guidelines are a little too much. It's just an extraordinary departure from the public rhetoric of this administration. I think Bill Barr on Tuesday was out giving a speech to sheriffs where he said we need to be super tough on criminals, and why, the people of interest to the president are getting a special break is something that's going to be very tough to explain.
Phil Rucker, in a normal West Wing, in a normal political shop, the domestic policy advisor may come up with policy initiatives to pivot off of post-impeachment for a president. Is there any such mechanism, any such plan in the West Wing you cover?
I mean, Brian, if there is, I've not heard of it. What we see in this West Wing, and it's what we've seen for 3 years now, is a constant churn from crisis to crisis, and a president scrambling every day for survival. He is fixated on the news cycles. He's fixated this week on what's happening at the Department of Justice. If there's a broad domestic legislative agenda underway, the American people don't really know about it, and the president is doing very little to promote that. He is, we should point out, going to be in Daytona Beach over the weekend at the Daytona 500. There are some reports that he may even take the motorcade on a lap of the racetrack. So he's fixated on campaign events like that and trying to promote his image more so, I would say, than legislating at this point.
It was Ronald Reagan who first learned to make the most politically of the Daytona 500. Susan Page, you're one of, full disclosure, you're one of 2 Susans we read with regularity around here. The other is Glasser, who writes for The New Yorker, and I quote from her to get your reaction. Although the president himself is unchanged, the context around him is very much altered. In the history of the Trump presidency, there will be a before impeachment and an after. Your view of that?
Oh, yes, I think so. I mean, there had been some speculation about what would be the effect of the impeachment process. We were sure that President Trump was going to be acquitted by the Senate, but what would be the effect on him? And there were some, including Susan Collins, who suggested he might be chastened, that he might have learned a lesson. That has clearly not been the case. President Trump is clearly been emboldened in the past week since he was acquitted by the Senate. We see that every day. We see that in his tweets. We see in what he's doing now in these criminal cases. I think we'll continue to see that. Do you think that Roger Stone is going to spend a day in jail between the Justice Department's actions and the presidential pardon? I would be, if I had a farm, I would not bet it on the idea that Roger Stone will actually spend a night in jail.
Well, Josh, let me give you 30 seconds on this because this judge is now in a tough spot. And the chief judge yesterday put out a statement kind of covering her employees, saying this office is not affected by outside pressures.
Right. And remember, this sentencing, unless it's deferred for some reason, is now basically less than a week away. It's next Thursday. It's supposed to take place. So the notion that this story will drop out of the headlines because the president's going to campaign rallies or something is just not going to happen. And there are so many little wheels spinning here in terms of the reviews that Barr has started in the Flynn case and in other cases that it's just hard to see this going away. I think that Amy Berman Jackson, the judge, will probably give a fairly stiff sentence to Roger Stone. She didn't seem to care for his behavior very much at all. So I think he's looking at a tough time. But like Susan says, he may get a pardon very quickly after that.
Yeah, the prospect of pardons just put everything into question. To Susan Page, to Philip Rucker, to Josh Gerstein, our thanks for joining us after the week we've all had late on a Friday night. And coming up, a closer look at the decision to clear Andrew McCabe, a case one federal judge says was run like an inquiry in a banana republic. And later, what happens in Vegas and Nevada as a whole may reshape the Democratic race in its own way yet again. We have a preview for you tonight when we continue as the 11th hour is just getting started on this Friday evening.
IG referrals to U.S. attorneys' offices are handled typically many times a year and very quickly. Typically, they're declined before the ink is dry on the IG's report. This one, they decided to spend 2 years thinking about. I'm sure a lot of that time was spent thinking about how frustrated the president would likely be when they came to the inevitable conclusion that there was no case here. But that's just a theory on my part.
There were some court transcripts released just today from a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. It's how we learn a lot of what we learn about this government. And those transcripts reveal what one federal judge thought about Trump's effect on Andrew McCabe's case. This judge happened to be appointed to the federal bench by Bush 43, and he warned prosecutors back in September that whatever decision they made on charging McCabe would be tainted by the president's comments on Andrew McCabe. In a closed-door meeting with prosecutors, the judge said, the public is listening to what's going on, and I don't think people like the fact that you've got somebody at the top basically trying to dictate whether somebody should be prosecuted. I think it's a banana republic when we go down that road. Back with us tonight is Frank Figliuzzi, a former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence. Frank, you said, I think on this broadcast, and I think about a week ago, that it was time for the DOJ to put up or shut up. They have chosen the latter. What do you make of this decision? And can Andrew McCabe go back to living his life?
Oh, Andy won't be able to live a life as he previously knew it. You can't do that when you've been subject to this kind of witch hunt and hoax for 2 years and your family's been subjected to it. I use the terms witch hunt and hoax deliberately because, as you know, Brian, the president's been claiming that he and his associates have been victims of a witch hunt and hoax. But here's the difference. In the witch hunt and hoax against Andrew McCabe, there's no charges to bring. There's no criminality there. In the alleged witch hunt and hoax against the president and people like Manafort and Flynn and Stone, we have an impeachment, we have convictions, we have 24 Russians indicted. That's the difference. There's nothing to bring when it comes to Andy McCabe.
When you hear the reporting out of the White House, we talked about it on this broadcast last night, that the president is tired of finding never-Trumpers throughout this government he has inherited and partially staffed. And it's a whiff of kind of loyalty tests as they go through the payroll. When you hear that, what are your thoughts regarding your beloved former bureau?
Yeah, it's so important for Americans to understand that the only thing that Department of Justice and FBI employees are loyal to is the Constitution and the oath they took when they signed on to the job. So, the president can continue to assert that there needs to be some loyalty to him or that people are partisan. He just doesn't get it. That's not why you sign up for the FBI or the Department of Justice. You sign up because you're all about the rule of law. And the sooner the president can figure that out, the better off we all will be.
Skeptics in the audience looked at AG Barr's remarks in the ABC News interview, especially skeptics in the audience who are adept at surviving office politics, let's say. And they came up with a scenario in their minds that Barr went to the boss and said, look, I got to kick you around a little bit in an interview because I just have to because of this Roger Stone case at all. What was your take as also a veteran of figuring out interpersonal communications?
Yeah, I'm one of those skeptics on this ABC interview, Brian. Look, the Attorney General has been disingenuous with us. I think he speaks with forked tongue, and here's why. You laid it out earlier. There was a Freedom of Information Act request that was about to expose a federal judge saying, hey, this thing stinks to high heaven. You better bring charges on McCabe or move on because this looks like a banana republic. And then, boom, all of a sudden, after 4 resignations at DOJ, we get Barr pushing back on tweets by the president. And then we find out, Brian, today there's been secret use of U.S. attorneys handpicked by this attorney general to continue to investigate who? McCabe, Comey, Pete Strzok, all around the interview of Mike Flynn and the Flynn investigation. So people who think Barr has changed his stripes need to understand that simply hasn't happened.
Frank Figliuzzi, thank you, as always, for joining us on the broadcast, Frank, and explaining all of this to us. And coming up for us, we're a week out from the Nevada caucuses. We have new numbers tonight from the place where numbers are king, where fortunes are won and lost every day. A rare new political poll in a state that's often very hard to figure out politically. Early voting begins for Nevada's Democratic caucus just a few hours from now. Voters there have until Tuesday to submit paper ballots before the actual caucuses get underway next Saturday. And wait till you hear the story of how they're going to be organized. A new telephone opinion poll of Nevada likely caucus goers has Senator Bernie Sanders still leading the pack, former VP Joe Biden second. Other Democratic contenders are neck and neck, well within the margin of error, it's been pointed out. Back with us tonight is our friend Jonathan Allen, NBC News senior political analyst, and our friend Errin Haines, veteran of the AP, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times. She is now editor-at-large for The 19th, a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom focused on gender, politics, and policy that launches this summer. Errin, it's great to see you. John, it's great to see you. John, since you're here in New York, home field advantage. You wrote recently, Sanders is winning ugly. What on earth did you mean by that, my friend John?
Well, we saw the first 2 contests. He got the most popular votes in Iowa. He got the most popular votes and a tie for delegates in New Hampshire. And in both cases, he got about 25% of the vote. He got wins, in terms of the popular vote, but he's not really getting a huge win there. And particularly in New Hampshire, he basically won because Amy Klobuchar was able to do well enough in third place to stop Pete Buttigieg from getting past Bernie Sanders. If Sanders wants to win the Democratic nomination, he's going to have to do better than 25% wins. And the reason that I say that is there are a lot of Democrats in the party, the establishment, that is lined up and wants to prevent him from being the nominee. In fact, some Democrats are so concerned about stopping him from taking over the party that it at times appears they are more concerned about that than winning the presidency. So in order to go into a convention and win, he can't go in as the leader with something like 25% of the delegates or 30% of the delegates. He's probably going to have to do better than that.
Errin Haines, I hope you can see a monitor where you are. I want to put 2 sets of South Carolina numbers up from the latest polling there. This is opinion poll of South Carolina Democrats going into their primary. You see 1 and 2, Biden, Sanders. Next is African-American voters going into South Carolina. Biden, Sanders, 36-20. Errin, what do you make of the numbers? And do you believe that these numbers, even though reflected in the latest poll, are on the move?
I think that they are definitely on the move. And what you are seeing in that Biden-Sanders split with black voters, Sanders finally starting to kind of erode the black support that Joe Biden has had with black voters really for much of this primary cycle, that seems to be generational from voters that I'm hearing from on the ground in South Carolina. You have older Black women who are really pretty still solidly with the former vice president. And frankly, he is making the case to them, like, if you can get me out of this state, I will deliver for you. And I think that they trust him, and I think that they believe him. And so they're ready to work for him in terms of getting that ground organization that he's going to need to frankly finish first, which I'm hearing from his campaign a lot, that he needs to have a strong, if not first place finish in South Carolina. Bernie Sanders is somebody that younger Black voters, especially younger Black women that I'm hearing from, are open to his candidacy. He's got the best ground game, from what I understand, in South Carolina right now. And that really marks a shift from 2016, when he didn't do as well with Black and brown voters. That was a problem for him. Hillary Clinton was able to capitalize on those folks in states like South Carolina and Super Tuesday states. And so to the extent that Senator Sanders has learned those lessons from 2016 and is building that multi-racial coalition that he is going to need should he become the nominee, I think that South Carolina is really going to be the first test of that.
And Errin, another quick question. Steyer's been on the air in South Carolina for a long time. Of course, now that we have two billionaires in this race, is Steyer making any genuine inroads?
Absolutely. A name that I do keep hearing come up is Tom Steyer in South Carolina, and that is because he has really been in that state up with radio ads locally. You see him everywhere on television, both local and national television in South Carolina. And so he is really working very hard to familiarize himself with voters in the state there. And what I hear is that effort feels much more like an investment than transactional, which is a word that I hear a lot when people talk about Mayor Mike Bloomberg, for example, and the way in which he is using his money to influence this election. The endorsements that he's racked up, for example, especially with Black mayors. The Columbia Mayor Steve Benjamin was one of the early endorsers of Mayor Bloomberg, and the Houston mayor just endorsed Mayor Bloomberg today. But, while some people see that as or say that you suggest that Mayor Bloomberg is buying Black leadership, for example, I think it's also important to point out that these, in a lot of cases, are longstanding relationships that Mayor Bloomberg has with these Black mayors in terms of giving money through his philanthropic organization to a lot of the cities that they govern, in a lot of cases stepping in where the federal government didn't to provide resources for those communities, but also training in terms of governance that has been very valuable. So, I think that both Mayor Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, the inroads that they're able to make with Black voters is going to be tested pretty soon.
John, did Bloomberg have a good week or a bad week?
I think he had a good week in that he was able to dominate a lot of the news coverage in a week where there was a primary that he didn't participate in. I mean, this was the shock and awe week of Mike Bloomberg jumping into the middle of a Democratic primary without being on the ballot, without being on a debate stage, and suddenly finding himself in third place in national polling after all these other people had been campaigning for about a year.
There is that, yeah.
But he is also now fending off, a tremendous amount of bad press. He is defending himself against the stop and frisk policy and various other things. So a mixed week for Mike Bloomberg, but absolutely a positive in terms of dominating coverage.
Our thanks to two of our friends, our own Jonathan Allen and to Errin Haines. We wish you a lot of luck with the new gig. Great to see you again. Thanks for coming on. And just ahead for us, how the president's tough talk and proposed defense spending is resurrecting fears that a couple of American generations have already lived through when we come back.
So you want to be president? I've watched many candidates run for their party's nomination, but only a few knew how to get it.
I am paying for this microphone.
My podcast is about what it takes to get the nomination. 6 episodes, 6 timeless themes that separate the few winners from the many losers.
The hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
So You Want to Be President with Chris Matthews, an MSNBC podcast. Search now wherever you're listening and subscribe. Episode 4 available now.
So you want to be president? I've watched many candidates run for their party's nomination, but only a few knew how to get it.
I feel your pain.
My podcast is about what it takes to get the nomination. 6 episodes, 6 timeless themes that separate the few winners from the many losers.
This campaign was and will remain the great honor of my life.
So You Want to Be President with Chris Matthews, an MSNBC podcast. Search now wherever you're listening and subscribe. Episode 4 available now.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. they will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
President seems to have ditched his love affair with North Korea, at least for now. Yesterday, The Atlantic published its interview with former Chief of Staff John Kelly from a college event in New Jersey, who said Trump's efforts to use personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un were futile. As Kelly puts it, I never did think Kim would do anything other than play us for a while, which he did, and he did that fairly effectively. But you wouldn't know it based on Trump's self-described expertise in nuclear arms control. In fact, the president has been touting this expertise on the issue since the 1980s.
A man who, at the age of 39, is not content with being New York City's latest real estate billionaire. Donald Trump has also ventured into gambling and professional football and says he could negotiate a nuclear disarmament treaty with the Soviet Union.
The Holy Trinity: gambling, professional football, and nuclear arms disarmament. A story we're about to hear from our next guest. Fred Kaplan is back with us on the broadcast, happens to be national security columnist for Slate. But more importantly for tonight, he happens to be the author of the new book, The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. While it is not necessarily germane to your work, please tell us the Donald Trump story.
Oh, it's very germane. He seriously lobbied to be George H.W. Bush's arms negotiator. He was, seriously talking to people. Bush nominated Richard Burt, veteran diplomat. Yeah. He runs into Burt at a cocktail party in New York and says, "Hey, you're the guy negotiating with the Russians, right?" He goes, "Yeah." And he goes, and Trump had just written the bestseller, The Art of the Deal. So he goes, "Hey, I've got a great idea how you can get a great deal from the Russians." He goes, "Yeah, what is it?" He goes, "Well, first meeting with him, you show up late. And then you walk over to their side of the table, you pound your fist on the table, and you say," and what he said, this isn't premium capo, but he says, "F you." And of course, Burt did not take his advice, negotiated a pretty good treaty within a couple of years, by which time another one of Trump's businesses had gone bankrupt.
The topic of your book, it strikes me, has been used twice in world history in anger, and we kept it there.
Right.
Is it, to you, akin to loosening norms that what we're seeing right now in our society, that another generation is coming up having not known the sheer awesome force of this? Are we getting too casual in tossing about mentions of it, threats of its use?
Casual is the word. Cavalier might be another that sums up Trump's attitude toward this. The famous meeting that took place in the tank, the Joint Chiefs Conference Room in the Pentagon on July 20th, 2017, there have been books that describe, calling the generals pussies and, weaklings and babies. Another thing that happened, he was shown a chart of number of nuclear weapons over the ages. And the peak was 1969, when we had 32,000 nuclear weapons. We have not quite 1/10 that number now. This was shown to show, the value of treaty making and the new stability in the world and so forth. But that's not how President Trump took it. He pointed to the peak of that. He goes, "How come I can't have as many nuclear weapons as we did back then?" And they explained to him all the reasons, and he seemed convinced. But I was told about a week later in a meeting in the White House with then National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster and some others, he remembered this chart again. He goes, "How come I can't have as many nuclear weapons as other presidents have had?" So, with him, this is why he loves a military parade, too. It has nothing to do with what you need for legitimate national security aims. It's bigger, stronger looking, more. He was upset that, Richard Nixon had more nuclear weapons than he did for no good reason, really.
Your closing quote, I'll leave the audience with this. "Past is not precedent. Some incalculable mix of shrewdness and sheer luck has kept the Holocaust at bay. Who knows how many wars we can dodge before an alignment of slow-wittedness and misfortune tips the balance the other way." That is why we chose to end this week and this Friday night on an upbeat, light topic, but we hope people read the stories contained in the book. Fred Kaplan, the author, here with us tonight. It is called The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. Speaking of presidents, coming up, a presidential historian's comparison of our first ever commander-in-chief with our 45th. The upcoming President's Day weekend begins a heavily promoted miniseries that will tell the story of George Washington. It is billed as a look at the full arc of Washington's journey from soldier to the first president of these United States.
Washington is, without question, the greatest hero and leader in American history, but he's a stranger.
I, George Washington, do solemnly swear.
People see him more as a monument than a person, but you can't understand him unless you acknowledge that he was human.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And when we understand the man behind the myth, it actually becomes empowering and inspiring for us.
Back with us tonight, Doris Kearns Goodwin, presidential historian and author who has written bestsellers about both Roosevelt's, Kennedy's, LBJ, Lincoln, for starters. Her latest work is Leadership in Turbulent Times. Here. She also happens to be executive producer of this three-part miniseries, Washington, about our nation's first president, narrated by Jeff Daniels. It premieres Sunday night, 8 p.m. Eastern on the History Channel. Doris, first of all, it's great to see you.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
Secondly, what are we apt to learn? What's a mass audience apt to learn about this guy that we haven't been told in American folklore? And what will people's minds do when they necessarily compare it to our times?
Well, I think the most important thing is what you said. It's the arc of his life. So you see him as a young man. He makes mistakes. He has losses. He suffers adversity. But the most important thing is his ability to grow. He learns from his mistake. He surrounds himself with people, a team, almost the original team of rivals, people who can argue with him in the Continental Army and then people who can argue with him in the presidency. And he grows through them. And he understands his weaknesses and he understands his strengths.
In the break, I asked you about his physicality, his bearing, how he's portrayed in the miniseries. Share with the folks what you said to me.
Yeah, there's a funny part of it where Joe Ellis, the historian, is talking about the fact that Martha was a great catch for him because she was wealthy and she could bring him land, but he was a great catch for her because he was a stud. You know, I'm not sure we think of him. He was taller than most people. Women talked about how gracefully he danced on the floor. No, he has a presence. He had a presence.
Also, it's an era you've written about and studied. Life was so hard. Not even by approaching it today's standards, we can't imagine it. But all of them in Philadelphia that hot summer were wearing wool and wigs, and if they were lucky, would dine on hot mutton and kind of a lukewarm ale at the end of the day. It was not a life.
No, that's really true. And then you think about escalating what you just described when he's at Valley Forge. And when he has to keep those soldiers alive, when the rations are cut down, when they're dying, 1/5 of them are dying, and yet gives them a sense of purpose. And by the end of it, they've survived enough to continue on. It's hard to imagine. Martha came and visited him at that time. And yeah, they lived. And the great thing about it is that one of the historians talks about the fact, it's General Powell who talks about the fact that he saw war young. He's in his first mission as a British officer. And so he's 22 years old. He sees people dying. He sees the toughness of life. And after that, you never think of war as an adventure again. You never think of it romantically again. You've experienced war.
And of course, General Powell, as a decorated combat veteran, knows that all too well. What is your theory about, does history find great men and women to step up and play in these roles, and or do they grow to the occasion?
I think they definitely grow to the occasion. I mean, one of the historians says he was not born great. He took a journey to greatness. And I think if you saw him at the beginning, he's making so many mistakes in those early days before the French and Indian War. And he screws up like human beings do. But what makes it possible is that they learn from that. And then opportunity arises, and he happens to be there, and he's the right man at the right time in the right place. I mean, he could have been anything he wanted to. He could have been a king. The most amazing thing that he leaves to us is the peaceful transfer of power. After the war was won, most generals take control of the government. Mm-hmm. He takes off his uniform, goes home, and decides that this is it. And the King George III says, oh, my God, if that's true that he really did that, he gave up power, he'd be the greatest man in the world. And then he's president for 2 terms. They want him to stay, 3rd, 4th. He could have stayed until he died, and he goes back home. So that's a really important lesson for all of us, that power can be transferred. He becomes a citizen again, and he's not a king. He's a president.
Put it this way. We had a choice of who to name our capital city after. I think by the end of part 3, most viewers will come away thinking we got that part really right. Doris Kearns Goodwin, loyal friend of this broadcast. Always a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much. Congrats on this. This is a great thing. Coming up for us, an unusual show and tell session as it played out in front of cameras today. Last thing before we go tonight is from an event at the White House today for the National Border Patrol Council. Big day for the president because he got to talk all about his wall and share photos. We'll hit you up with some facts at the end of this, but here's one to start with. The president wants to divert $4 billion of Pentagon spending to continue his project. And it looks like even Republicans may object to that. But for now, the president seems very proud of his project.
I don't know if you can see this, but it's pretty impressive. These are different pictures, different shots. This is the wall going up. They're working at night, as you can see. Either that or it's an extremely dark day. Here's another shot. This is a shot of a little different section. After it's up, it gets spray painted black. The black makes it extraordinarily hot, especially in areas along the Mexican border. It's not known for cold weather. It's known for quite hot weather. The black absorbs the heat. So not only would you have to be a good climber, but you're going to have to bring a hose with lots of water to water it down, and there aren't too many hoses in the area. Virtually impossible to climb over the top. Here's another shot, but we got it built. And I made your jobs a lot easier. Say thank you, Mr. President.
Finally, and as promised, a fact check from the federal government. Border Protection put this out 20 days ago, showing that as of last month, 99 miles of new wall have been constructed where an old existing barrier stood. There has been 1 mile of totally new wall construction along a section of the border where no barrier previously stood. On that note, that is our broadcast for this Friday night as we bring another week to a close. Happy Valentine's Day to all. Thank you for being here with us. Have a good weekend and good night from our NBC News headquarters here in New York.
Hey guys, Willie Geist here. This week on the Sunday Sit Down podcast, I get together with Golden Globe-winning actor Ewan McGregor to talk about a prolific career that includes his latest role in the superhero film Birds of Prey. Get that conversation now for free wherever you download your podcasts.